كيف أثر إغلاق المدارس على الطلبة في المجالات غير المعرفية؟ ما الطرائق التي استخدمتها المدارس لتساعد الطلبة على اكتساب مهارات غير معرفية مثل المرونة والمسؤولية والتعاطف والتواصل؟ سنكون في هذه الجلسة مع الدكتور ديرك فان دام الذي يعمل كباحث أول في مركز إعادة تصميم المناهج الدراسية في بوسطن الأمريكية، وكان أحد المستشارين في مديرية التعليم والمهارات في منظمة التعاون الاقتصادي والتنمية في باريس، ورئيس مركز البحوث التربوية والابتكار.
I would like to remind you finally that there will be a certificate of attendance through which you will receive through your email after the forum concludes. And your opinion is of a great value. So please make sure to complete this survey as a feedback for the forum that you will receive after the forum to your emails. Is it likely that social and emotional learning have benefited from the coping strategies which children had to develop in contrast to cognitive learning? How did school closures affect the context and ways through which skills such as resilience, responsibility, empathy, or communication are acquired? Let's listen to the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Curriculum Redesign in Boston, Dr. Dirk Van Damme, who was the Senior Counselor in the Directorate for Education and Skills at the OECD in Paris and the head of the Center for Educational Research and Innovation. Please, Dr. Van Damme.
Dear Nabila and dear participants, thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful event. Well, I'm very pleased and honored to share my thoughts on this question. And let me share my screen. I hope you can see now my my PowerPoint. Well, first of all, I was tempted to address this issue of the non-cognitive learning gains during the COVID-19 pandemic, because this is a topic very dear to me. When I was at the OECD, I launched a big survey on social emotional skills. The data were collected before the pandemic, but still the insights are, I think, still relevant. But I have to admit that we have not so much data on what has happened with non-cognitive learning during the pandemic. So I will present you some preliminary findings from a couple of countries, but not so much data have been collected so far. So this is still an area of work under exploration, and I hope that more research will be done in the coming years to shed light on this very interesting question. So what I will do is to give you an overview, and maybe I will have some overlaps with preceding speakers. I was not able to attend all the sessions that has been presented to you during the last 2 days. So I hope I have not too much overlap, but still let's see where we can gathered. Let me just give you a very brief picture of the impact of school closures in general. We have seen a lot of variation in school closures in countries, and I apologize, I will mainly speak about OECD countries because that's where my data come from. But we are working with the OECD together with UNESCO and the World Bank on having an excellent data set of what the school closures have meant for a number of countries. But most of the information I will present come from OECD countries. The variation between countries is huge, but also the variation between levels of education. For what we know, upper secondary level has been hit most, with 56% of total instruction days that have been lost. well, maybe not completely lost. I will come back to that question. But between the 1st of January 2020 and May 21, 56% of instruction days at upper secondary level have been confronted with school closures. I mentioned already that there has been a huge variation among countries, and this is apparent from this chart. You see some countries at the right where, let's say, the number of days that schools have been closed are around 50 or even less. But you see at the left, countries like Mexico, Costa Rica, etc. These countries have been hit very heavily with school closures. And outside of the OECD, in countries like Brazil or Latin America more in general, or other parts of the world, you see huge numbers of days that schools have been closed. If we take the regional perspective, you see Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, they have adopted a very different policy with regard to school closures, also with regard to the pandemic in general. And you see that has resulted in a very limited number of school closure days. In contrast to that, Latin America has been hit most heavily with 29 weeks of complete or partial school closures. And these data have been collected only before the early weeks of 21. So probably the numbers have been increasing very heavily since then. The world average until January 21 is 22 weeks of complete or partial school closure. So the differences between countries, between regions of the world are huge. But what is most worrisome, and this chart is an illustration of that, is that what we see is that countries where school closures have been very high are also the countries which did not perform well in PISA 2018. So there is a negative relationship between the number of days or weeks that schools have been closed and the performance on PISA 2018. This is quite worrisome because it means that the pandemic will have a worsening impact on those countries who had already mediocre or very low results in PISA. So when we will do the next PISA in 23, you know probably that the PISA 21 has been postponed, but we will see an increase in the learning gap, the learning outcomes gap between countries in different parts of the world. So the rich countries will see less learning loss than the middle income or low income countries in PISA, and that's quite worrisome. We will see an intensification of the learning crisis that the world has already seen before the pandemic, but after the pandemic, the picture will look much more worrisome. Of course, there has been distance learning. And I have to say, I am maybe different from other experts. I do not belong to the pessimists. I think school closures and the experience with distance learning is not overall problematic, but I will come back to that. We see an enormous energy which has been displayed by the education systems over the world by trying to still serve students in the best possible ways through all kinds of distance learning solutions. Online platforms, there has been a huge experience now with distance learning through digital platforms, but also, let's say, low-tech solutions like television, radio, or applications through mobile phones, have been implemented in countries. This is quite unique. I am actually quite impressed by the versatility, by the flexibility of school systems around the world, by moving to different kinds of delivery modes from one day to another in many cases. Maybe in the beginning, in spring 2020, it was quite chaotic, but many systems have been quite proficient in moving to other forms of delivery of teaching and learning, either by digital means or by television or whatever. So what we have seen in the world is a remarkable capability of education systems to move from face-to-face learning to all kinds of other ways of delivering content and delivering teaching and learning. Maybe not as effective as face-to-face learning in schools, but as I said, I'm not convinced that it has been all very problematic and detrimental to the learning of students. Of course, digital learning opportunities are confronted with all kinds of issues and problems. The most obvious problem is, of course, the availability of infrastructure, of digital tools and digital devices, and connectivity. This is what we call the first digital divide. Many countries are still confronted, and you see here figures from, let's say, affluent countries, but the situation is, of course, much more problematic in middle income and low income countries. So the digital divide, of course, limits the capacity of education systems to use digital means to maintain and to improve learning. These data come from PISA 2018, so before the pandemic, and you see already the huge gaps between countries, but also within countries between disadvantaged schools and advantaged schools in the availability of digital devices for learning. And you see Jordan here at the lower end of the distribution, not among the worst off countries, but still not doing really well in terms of the availability in 2018 of digital devices for instruction. The same picture emerges when we look at online platforms. Are there online platforms available for schools and teachers to provide teaching and learning to students? Again, before the pandemic, the picture looks quite gloomy for a number of countries. Jordan is here a little bit more in the middle, but still. Let me then turn to the actual topic of my talk today, and I will give you a quite nuanced picture on the multidimensional impact of COVID-19. Let me first focus on study time, and I will show a few data that we have from a number of countries on the impact of study time. Moving from face-to-face learning to digital or other means of delivering content to students has resulted in a severe drop in study time. But the consequences are not very clear. Is a reduction in study time harmful for student learning or not? That's a very interesting question. What is the impact on cognitive skills development? We have some results from surveys and research projects in a number of countries. I will briefly discuss that. What are the impact on social and communication skills? Students have been deprived of their usual networks, meeting friends and colleague students at school. But does that mean that their social skills have suffered or not? A very important question. The social emotional learning. skills like resilience, responsiveness, conscientiousness, openness, etc. There are different opinions among experts. Some experts say, yeah, their social emotional learning has suffered a lot, maybe more than cognitive learning. I am not convinced. I think that students have shown remarkable resilience, and that some students have suffered, but others have also gained from the unusual experience that the COVID-19 pandemic meant for them. Changes in parent-child relationships. Parents have also been confronted with a number of challenges. Sometimes they were forced to telework. They have to share equipment. The usual division of labor in the household was changed. Time structures have changed. And that has resulted in maybe parents also becoming much more nervous, much more stressed. And that has affected also parenting styles. And there are some emerging research data that show that parenting has changed during the pandemic because the situation in households has changed a lot. Digital skills. Students were forced, but not only students, but also teachers were forced to learn on the spot and to develop their digital skills. Digital skills were not excellent in most countries. We know that from PISA, from PIAC, also other surveys among teachers. We know that digital skills of teachers and students were not excellent before the pandemic. But have they increased during the pandemic? That's also a research question on which we do not have the final answer, but some preliminary data are quite positive. Changes in attitudes and values. Some also values with regard to schooling. Students have started to look at schools differently than before the pandemic. Maybe they were bored at school, or maybe they did not have quite a positive picture of schooling. Also, that might have changed. Metacognition and self-regulation. Students were asked to rely on their own self-regulation skills, their planning skills. So when they have to go on the internet or when they on an online platform, they were forced to steer their own learning. How well were they capable of doing that? Psychosocial well-being, another very important question. I see a lot of very easy answers to the well-being question. And it is, in my view, far too easy to say that all students have suffered in their well-being. I simply think that this is not true, and I don't see the research data supporting such claims. I think some students have suffered, other students have not suffered. And there are some data, and I will show you a couple of them in a minute, which indicate or suggest that some students were even happier than before the pandemic. And then what are the outcomes with regard to graduation? I will come back at the end. So I will not be able to give you answers on all these questions. I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the complexity of the issues. And I really would like you I would like to ask you to refrain from giving very easy, immediate answers to those questions. We still don't have enough research to give final answers to those questions, and we have to face them with an open mind. Some answers on study time. This comes from a Swiss research project during the pandemic, during school closures in 2020, and you see that students reduced their study time significantly. But there is also an indication that when students did study that the study was more intensive. So the study time at school is not always very effective. So a reduction of study time does not mean a reduction in learning. It depends what students did during their time. And this comes from a very interesting, just published German study where they monitored the time that was used by students by dividing it between attending school and learning for school. And you see again that both low achievers and high achievers reduce their study time. But low achievers a little bit more than high achievers. So high achievers, the best students, were probably better able to monitor their own study time carefully and to be a bit more disciplined and using their time for study. But they also reduced their study time. The researchers divided the time that students that they had their disposal between conducive activities that are probably positive for learning, and detrimental activities that are less positive for learning. For example, reading increased, the time spent on reading increased, both for low performers and high performers. The time spent on music and creative work and on physical exercise increased. So this is positive. Detrimental activities increased as well because students had much more time. So they were watching TVs, they were gaming, using social media or online activities which are not related to learning. And here the most worrisome result is that low achievers during the pandemic increased their time for those so-called detrimental activities much more than high achievers did. So this is something which comes back again and again in all data. The gap between students increased, but not all students suffered equally. Some students benefited from the new situation, but the more disadvantaged students from social background, from economic background, from cultural background, or related to their attitudes to schooling, some of the students who were already suffering, they suffered more during the pandemic. This is coming back again and again in all research that I have seen. This comes from a question again in Germany, where parents were asked how effective did children use their time for learning at home versus at school. And you see that actually in the whole sample, 44%, 45% of parents thought that the effectiveness of the use of time was equal or better when students were at home than they were at school. But again, with huge differences between low achieving students or high achieving students, or children from parents with an academic background or not academic background. So the gap has increased, but the study time was not a problem for all students, actually. This is something which lends me to think that actually the pandemic created also opportunities for self-directed learning, for self-directed skills development for a number of students, probably the minority, but still it was not problematic for all students. Let us move to some comments on the data on cognitive learning. And this is an interesting chart because it comes from real-time data in a couple of states in the United States who were already using digital platforms for mathematics learning. So this is real-time data from a mathematical learning platform that were used at school. And you see that the 3 different income categories, or children from families in 3 different income categories, they were following more or less the same path before the pandemic. And then suddenly the pandemic struck, schools were closed, students were asked to still use the same platform, but not at school, now at home. And you see that the top income quartile, they continued more or less. So they were more or less still successful in finishing and completing math lessons and do the tests online, but the middle and the bottom income quartile, they suffered more. So again, not all students suffered, but the gap here in income in the household, the gap between students increased a lot. In England, the same picture, based on teachers' reports. Teachers reported an increase in the learning gap, in the attainment gap between students from a poorer background and students from a richer background. But the assessment by teachers was not consensual. And so some teachers thought that all students had suffered. Some teachers thought that some students benefited from the new situation. The information that we see emerging from research on the cognitive learning differs from country to country, and it's still very difficult to say what the reason is. Look at, for example, these data from France. And they are population data, so all covering all students. And what these data show you here is that the results in January 21 were better than the results in January 2020 with regard to different forms of reading and language skills. Actually, in France, we have many test data, assessment data that we can use to assess the cognitive gains of students. And remarkable in France, with those population level data, they are showing more positive results during the pandemic than before the pandemic. It is still very early day to say why, because these French data stand in contrast to data from, for example, the Netherlands or Germany or the UK, where we see drops in learning. France might be a little bit of an exception, but the quality of the data in France is so high that we are struggling to give a good explanation. But it shows again that the overarching picture that also cognitive learning suffered for all students, that this picture is not correct. We see different data for different countries, for different groups of students. And Australia is also an exception. This comes from a very interesting research project in Australia for 4th grade students in math and reading. And again, no significant learning loss has been detected in this sample of Australian schools. Let me focus on digital skills. And I already mentioned that there are some indications that digital skills improved rapidly during the pandemic. And this comes from Germany, and it shows you, again, it is an assessment by parents. Parents had to indicate whether their children were better able to handle digital technologies, and you see the results, which are incredibly positive. So the vast majority of parents, but again, with differences between high and low achieving students or by educational background of parents, but still digital skills have improved quite significantly during the pandemic. Let me turn to some questions on well-being. And of course, the stress level of parents and children has increased during the pandemic, no question about that. This comes from a very interesting monitoring research project in France, where they continue to monitor levels of anxiety among the population. And you see that parents with children below the age of 16, they had much higher anxiety than the adult population in general. And this is, of course, an indication that in the households, the whole change from the normal organization of the day where children went to school, the sudden shift to online learning, so often combined with teleworking of parents and the reorganization of the household, etc., that this caused anxiety, stress for parents and probably also for children.
Excuse me, Dr. Van Damme, excuse me, we have 1 minute left.
Oops. Yeah.
If you want to wrap up.
Yeah.
we are enjoying anyway.
I'm sorry for taking so much time, but these data are so interesting. Well, this shows you, and it comes from data from the Netherlands, that indeed there have been mental health issues, but not across the board. I will not expand too much on this, but let me maybe jump to this slide. And what I want to say here is that the social emotional well-being and skill development data that we have, and again, I'm stressing the fact that we have very little data so far, but that they show you one thing. It is not problematic for all students, but it is problematic for some students and beneficial for other students. So the gap, the differences are much more important than the averages. On average, we do not see the huge problems that some people proclaim to be. We see huge variation and much more movement towards the extremes of the distribution. I'll jump this and I'll have my closing slide. What I'm convinced of is that the COVID-19 pandemic has been a huge crisis, no problem, no doubt about that, but also a huge opportunity. Not all the consequences have been problematic, and the COVID-19 pandemic has been an opportunity for schools, teachers, parents, students to rethink learning, to be innovative, and to be transformative. I am very concerned about the general tendency that I see in most countries to move to the old normal as soon as possible. We should not miss this opportunity to ask the question, how can we improve education? How can we improve the resilience of education systems, of schools, of teachers, of parents, of households with regard to learning? How can we create better conditions for learning? And how can we invest more in the skills of teachers, but also in using the experiences that they went through, and by integrating teachers better in a crisis scenario, because this will not be the last pandemic. This will not be the last systemic crisis for the education system. We have to learn from it, and we have to use the opportunity that the pandemic offers to do better. Thank you so much, and sorry for taking too much time.